Great. Welcome to the fourth hearing of the Committee's inquiry into children and young people with disability in New South Wales educational settings. I acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians on the lands on which we're meeting today, and I pay my respects to elders past and present, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of New South Wales. I also acknowledge and pay my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today or watching online. My name is Abigail Boyd. I am chair of this committee. I ask everyone in the room to please turn their mobile phones to silent. Parliamentary privilege applies to witnesses in relation to the evidence they give today. However, it does not apply to what witnesses say outside of the hearing. I urge witnesses to be careful about making comments to the media or to others after completing their evidence. In addition, the Legislative Council has adopted rules to provide procedural fairness for inquiry participants, and I encourage committee members and witnesses to be mindful of these procedures. Please also note that Auslan interpreters will be interpreting at this hearing for the gallery and live broadcast. I ask members and witnesses to please make sure you speak clearly into the microphone and wait until the previous speaker has finished talking. I will now welcome our next panel of witnesses. Thank you very much for being here and making the time to give evidence. If I could please ask each witness, and I'll start with Ms. Foley, to state their name and position title and then swear either the oath or the affirmation.
My name is Maureen Foley. I'm the National Disability Officer of the National Union of Students, and I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. And Ms. Adamovic.
Hi, I'm Kira Demvik. I'm representing as a former TAFE student, and I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Would you like to begin by making a short opening statement?
Yes, please.
Go ahead.
Good morning. I would also like to begin by extending my respects to the traditional owners of the Gadigal people whose land I'm currently on. My name is Maureen Foley. I am the National Disability Officer for the National Union of Students. We represent over 1.2 million students nationally and fight for the right for accessible and equitable higher education. When talking about disabled people in education, the conversation never extends to higher education. There is always talk of primary and secondary, segregated units, and the importance of inclusive education, but it is never about the lifelong right to pursue knowledge. In New South Wales, only 7.44% of university undergraduates are students with disabilities, and currently only 11% of TAFE students identify as having a disability. This is despite the fact we know that there is an improvement in employability prospects for disabled students with a bachelor's degree, certificate, or TAFE qualification, and the employment penalty decreases each time upon gaining further education. The biggest barrier to employment is second only to the consequences of having a disability itself. The biggest barrier to employment, second only to having a disability itself, is the lack of necessary qualifications and skills. And yet most school leaver pathways encourage young disabled people post-secondary to look immediately into employment rather than further education. Education is important, and supporting disabled students to pursue education outside of just needs to be more than just academic adjustments being universally applied. It also involves calling for external supports that are holistic and address all needs to help students. Sorry.
You're okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
When I was 15, was diagnosed with ADHD, autism and dyslexia. This was a long time coming. Since I was young, I've really struggled with learning, especially in primary and secondary education. And I then got the support that I needed from secondary education, but it still was not enough for me to be confident to go to university. My next pathway was TAFE. I always loved working with my hands, so I had gotten an apprenticeship and I had gone to TAFE. On the first class, the first thing my teacher ever said to the class was, I will try and help you the best I can, but we do not have support for you guys who have significant disabilities. We do not, you can try and ask, but it doesn't exist. I always did really well in TAFE, but I always had to help other TAFE students with disabilities who were incredible, and they were smart, and they could have done a lot for the air conditioning industry. But instead they were failed by the TAFE system, which is a skeleton of what it is, especially for students with disabilities. TAFE is the best choice for some of us. We sometimes can't handle the stress of university or the workload that university gives us. So TAFE becomes the best option, but there is no support for us at TAFE. I had to then quit my apprenticeship because of my experiences with disabilities within my apprenticeship and not being able to handle the stress that came with it, the working times due to insomnia, and the multiple different directions I was given, and it contributed to significant mental health problems where I had to step down. I then have moved into a different career in warehousing that has offered me that flexibility that can accommodate my disability, and I will be going back to TAFE. But it's quite evident that the lack of apprentices, especially how I know a lot of apprentices are people with disabilities, the reason why they are quitting their apprenticeships is because they don't have support. They don't have support through TAFE, they don't have support through their apprenticeships, and they can't get flexible working conditions from their apprenticeships. So it's very, very hard for us in TAFE, and it's getting worse and worse every single day that this situation is ignored.
Thank you very much. I'll just ask if anyone wants to go first.
Yeah, look,
Mr. Diatta.
thanks both of you for your evidence today and for appearing. I suppose, Ms. Domovic, I wanted to ask about what kind of supports, what do they actually look like? What kind of things would have made a difference to keeping you at TAFE?
So I think particularly TAFE, the support that's really, I'm always an advocate for proactive support because it is very, very terrifying to actually have to reach out for that support, and it's also very hard as well. That support needs to be across the board, which means better learning conditions for all students, not just those who are disabled. It also means that there needs to be a roadmap for how these systems are going to be put in place, because you can't do it straight away. Also, in apprenticeships, there needs to be... This is not something... I think that there needs to be a look into, is there a way to make employers have to offer those flexible conditions for apprenticeships, or incentivise employers offering apprentices flexible working conditions, especially those apprentices with disabilities. But what would have kept me in is because I was very terrified to reach out for help. If there had been proactive support, if the actual system had been set up better for all students, that I wasn't the one with the burden of having to reach out for support, to have to do the paperwork for support, to call 3 different agencies and go, hey, I need support for this. That is a huge burden on people with disabilities. And there was a reason why I also didn't reach out for that help, and I also knew that it didn't exist.
And perhaps, Ms. Foley, perhaps you might be able to talk about the kinds of supports that should be available in university context.
Yeah, of course. So we all know that academic adjustments are required to be provided to students with disabilities. However, there is zero oversight to their enforcement, and their enforcement equally across all institutions and universities. So if you are a student at a GO8 university, you are less likely to receive your academic supports than you are for a university that might be more holistic in its approach to student participation. There are countless of stories of students in law and medicine and science where those industries are considered academically rigorous, and therefore I think a student quoted to me one of their lecturers, "If you're unable to keep up with the pace, you shouldn't be here," which is appalling. But academic adjustments can't be the only support. The DSP, for example, is only available to a very select few number of students. It's extremely restrictive, and you also aren't able to study full-time on the DSP. It's a cap of 30 hours. But you need to be a full-time student to access other supports. And so if you somehow are able to apply for it, you have to toss up between whether the extra cost of other supports for an example, concession cards, for travel concession. There is a policy where you are meant to be able to apply for a travel concession if you're a student who's gone part-time due to disability. But very few universities actually advertise it. For an example, at the University of Sydney, they only awarded 117 concession cards to disabled students between 2019 and 2023 because they refused to advertise it, and they also assessed whether or not they deemed the student disabled enough to deserve it, which that's not the university's job. That needs to be enforced by the government, and that process shouldn't be up to whether or not your university is supportive of disabled students. Another part is the lack of paid placements outside, or flexible placements, for a matter of fact. If you're in social work, nursing, you have to take those placements if you do those degrees, except you often have to quit your job. You have to most of the time they call for full-time placements. There's no flexibility in whether or not you can do 3 days a week or you can do part-time days or part-time hours to ensure that you can actually get through your placement, because with that support, a disabled student can. But forcing them to do a 5-day week, like 9 to 5, where there's no flexibility, you're asking someone to put themselves in physical, mental stress, and ultimately that will cause dropouts. So supports that address different aspects. Another part is, sorry, I'm just having a think. A lot of people think that you can use if you're an NDIS participant, the assumption is that you can use your NDIS by external parties. So for an example, universities or certain agencies think that you can use your NDIS funding for education support, which you can't. That is not possible. You can't spend your NDIS getting extra tutoring, where if you're in a TAFE system where there's no support provided for you, you can't use funding that you may be receiving to get a support system. So therefore you're stuck in out-of-pocket costs. And also out-of-pocket costs grow and accumulate. There are students who are spending $800 on medication because they can't access healthcare cards, because like the DSP, it's extremely restrictive. Most people don't qualify, or if they are under the age of independence, which is not. If you're under the age of independence, or they're deemed they're living at home because they can't afford to move out because they're spending thousands of dollars trying to survive, or trying to create a support system to get themselves through education because it's not being provided, then if you're living at home, then you don't get access to certain support systems, or you don't get support, you don't get funding supports, which means it's a cycle where you kind of just end up stuck. And sometimes you're forced to choose between whether or not you want to pay for your medication that you can't live without, or whether or not you want a degree. But if you don't get a degree, or if you don't get a TAFE certification, then you are guaranteed, I think it's about 34% less likely to have a high income job, which obviously then you're stuck in a cycle of poverty. and it just goes on and on and on.
Can I ask you? We've heard a lot in this inquiry about the problems and the obstacles that are caused for people with disability in our education systems because of a lack of resources and funding, etc. But then we also hear a lot about the obstacles created by discrimination and ignorance and ableism. How much of that do you see in the tertiary setting? Do you have any examples of, that you can point us to in relation to discrimination?
Yep. I would also like to just note that the discrimination can be direct and it can also be indirect. And it differs between, in the higher education space, it quite often differs between what you're actually studying. For cases of, and I also would address indirect discrimination because that often flies under the radar. For an example, there was a student who, I'll just refer to them as a student for anonymous reasons, but they were studying science at one of the universities in Sydney, and they were denied accessible adjustments for their exam. And the justification behind it was, we can't afford that adjustment, or it's it was, the student was talking about how it was some nonsensical reason of it was too expensive to provide XYZ adjustment, or it was in another case of same student, different exam, it was unfair to the other students that they could write on their laptop when their peers had to do a written exam, but they couldn't hold a pen, and so therefore writing was off the table, and if they can't use a laptop they can't do their exam. But it's not saying, oh, it's because you're disabled, it's unfair to other students. But because the Disability Discrimination Act doesn't provide consequences for indirect discrimination, you have to prove beyond doubt that you're discriminated against because of your disability. There are no consequences for the lecturers or the universities that try and let that discriminate. It's still discrimination, but there's no consequences. You can't enforce it. Another example is a student was denied their support animal on campus, because it wasn't a guide dog. And the university didn't acknowledge that emotional support animals are a valid form of support. And instead they chose to discriminate against the student, but it was because, oh no, that's a more example of direct discrimination, where it's like them refusing to acknowledge what is in fact a support animal. But it's because the onus is on the universities to determine what is a reasonable adjustment, what is a reasonable support. And because there's no consequences or oversight for actually, no, that's not, like, you can't do that. Or no, that is a support, you're just being ableist. Discrimination cases tend to fly under the radar. Most often in law and science, it's cases of extremely long, intense exams where they're very hard subjects. I have much respect for people who do them, but oh, actually, sorry, let me clarify. For an example, if you're in biomedicine, there is an expectation, or I haven't managed to determine whether or not it is actually a board requirement or whether or not it's a university enforced requirement, but you get to a certain level, usually when you're trying to apply for, at the end of your degree, you've done your biomedicine degree, you want to become a doctor, there are certain policies where they're like, no, you can't have a disability of a certain type. You've gone through your entire degree, and yet you get rejected at the very end because, oh no, if you've got an XYZ disability, there's no way you can fulfill your job. Deaf students are told that they can't pass their exams because they can't use a stethoscope, but there are Bluetooth stethoscopes that exist, but universities then deem them too expensive, won't buy them, won't provide them to the deaf students. And so a deaf student is now forced to drop out of their medical degree because they can't use a piece of equipment that could easily be subbed out. And it's not their fault, it's the university's fault. And those cases of discrimination often don't get called up upon because they're like, oh no, it's resource funding, we can't afford it. Where it's, no, you can afford it, you're recording quite good profits. You should be able to afford adjustable support tools to get through your degree for students.
Thank you. Very good examples.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you both for appearing today and for your advocacy, but also your articulate evidence. It's really good to hear from you and your own experiences. I wanted to ask, picking up on something that you said, Miss Foley, but I'm happy for both of you to answer. You talked about how often the focus is on what happens for students with disability at school, but then you also mentioned that students tend to be sort of pushed, not to use that word, but into employment more so than higher education. From your experiences, what could have been done better while you were at school, and particularly maybe in your last couple of years at school, to give you more of an idea of choice and options, and how do you think we could make some suggestions to improve that process?
Yeah, because I'm going to pass to Kira on this one.
That's okay.
Yep. So I had disability support during school. I needed disability support during my HSC. What probably would have been really, and I went straight, as soon as I left school, there was nothing to support me after that. I had to go straight. My only thing was my mum.
Yeah.
And she was able to find me a job. And that's how I then got into my apprenticeship and the TAFE system. What would have been really good for me is if there was support after school. So there's that potentially you've required disability support during secondary school. There's a disability, there's after school disability support people. So once you graduate, they're going to go, okay, what do you want to do now? Do you want to go into employment? Do you want to go into TAFE? Do you want to go into universities? They might be the people communicating with these universities and to these TAFEs going, this is what such and such person needs. And also that would be useful in secondary schools as well if there was an external, even if there was an internal support person in the school who would then work with you after you've graduated school to get you either into employment or into that tertiary education, depending on what the disabled person wants to do. I really wanted to go to university, but I couldn't because I did not have the support necessary to get me into university. That's then when I went straight to employment, and I was lucky enough to then be able to go into TAFE from that employment. So yeah, there needs to be support after we graduate. There is none. I received none, and I had to receive disability support in school. It was basically that I was on me and my family, we were on our own. And some families, especially families in who are immigrant families who might not be able to speak English, or who also might have disabilities of their own, they will not, the outcomes, I had pretty great outcomes, but that was because my mum speaks English. My mum is really good with getting me into those disability programs to aid me in my employment. But a lot of people with disabilities don't have that, and that support needs to be there, and it's also for families as well.
Yeah, so someone to help you transition from school to whatever's next.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
Go ahead, Ms. Val.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you to you both for coming today and for your evidence so far. I wanted to pick up on a couple of things you said, Ms. Foley, but the question is really to both of you, and answer as you see fit. You talked about the onus is on the university to determine what is a reasonable adjustment, and then you also mentioned, I think, the tertiary education roadmap. Would a potential tertiary education roadmap for students with disability, would that help to address issues such as the onus being on the university? and or what regulatory frameworks do we need to look at that have, potentially failed students with a disability?
Yeah. So the tertiary education roadmap that the NUS is campaigning for is calling for a roadmap that explains the exact steps that governments and departments will take to ensure that the gaps in the disability education sector will be filled for higher education. In the Accords process, they announced that the target participation rate should be 8%, which is actually lower than the current participation rate at 11%. The Accords also excluded people with classified by the ABS as profoundly disabled from its data, under the statement that we didn't believe that that people with profound disabilities could be or would want to be in higher education, which is an appalling stance to take because everyone deserves the right to pursue higher education. In terms of regulatory frameworks, so I'm just going to take a second to think, but for an example, the New South Wales State Ombudsman classifies that it says that it can address higher education for public complaints processes for public universities in New South Wales, and yet most of the time when a case is referred to the State Ombudsman, it's called a federal matter and is referred to a different ombudsman. And I know the Accords process proposed a student ombudsman that would address these complaints. However, there's no direct pathway for making complaints about reasonable adjustments or for disability or discrimination. The student ombudsman proposed by the Accords addresses an equity commissioner. The New South TEXA, the tertiary education quality body, doesn't follow up with complaints made about discrimination because they're single off, according to TEXA, they're one-off cases, which is not the case. Usually most students are experiencing what is, if one student's experiencing it, there's a really high chance that another student is as well. And it's making sure that there is a pathway for students to be able to go to someone who understands disability, who understands what a reasonable adjustment constitutes, and ensuring that there is an informed, safe pathway to report disability discrimination, and it should be both within the New South Wales State Ombudsman and to have that pathway as well as the soon-to-be proposed student ombudsman. And also in terms of gaps in regulatory frameworks, addressing indirect discrimination, that clause, the SCLAVOS clause in the Disability Discrimination Act, which, yes, I know is not a specifically New South Wales thing, but it's something that you have the power to push for. And bridging that gap where people can get away with indirect discrimination would allow so many students to feel more empowered to report stuff, because at the moment you're just told that there's nothing we can do, or you're gaslit into thinking, well, there's no point. I know friends who have reported stuff and it's gone nowhere. It's just been traumatic. I do have another part of thought, but it's kind of half formed, so I'll come back to it when it's fully formed.
You can always provide further answers on notice as well. We unfortunately are running very low on time now. We're quite over. I will just check though with Miss McLaren-Jones if she had a burning question.
No, that's fine. Thank you.
All right. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for. I think we could keep talking to you for many hours. But to the extent that we have supplementary questions, the committee secretariat will be in touch. But that concludes this panel for now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Welcome our next witness. Dr. Roy, if I could start by asking you to please state your name and position title and then swear either the oath or the affirmation.
My name is Dr. David Roy. I'm a lecturer at the University of Newcastle, and I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God.
Thank you very much. And would you like to begin by making a short opening statement?
Very briefly, firstly to thank the committee for holding this inquiry 7 years after the previous. I think it's important. These are nuanced issues, and I hope I can help in whatever way possible.
Thank you. That was brief. I will throw... Are you ready?
No, you can start.
You're not ready?
I'm not quite ready.
No, I'd say that was too short.
I was maybe expecting Dr. Roy to go for a little bit longer before I was
I'm well known for being verbose, so I felt I should let the committee have their time.
So your submission is quite heavily focused on abuse within schools, and as I said in the previous panel, a lot of what we're trying to tease out here is how much of the obstacles that children with disability face in schools and other educational settings is due to sort of lack of resources and training, etc., and how much of it is due to ableism or discrimination. Do you want to maybe talk about that?
I don't think you can necessarily separate those issues of funding, of attitude, as has come through from multiple inquiries, and I have a funny feeling that the current inquiry that's being looked at by the, I always get the term wrong here, the not the Accounting General, there's an inquiry looking at disability across New South Wales that's being looked at, and also the way the system is created.
The Auditor General.
The Auditor General, thank you
Yes.
very much. The Auditor General is currently doing a review. But even the way the system is created perpetuates itself and perpetuates challenges for children with a disability, challenges for staff in managing that, and gives opportunities for individuals to take advantage of that at times. And yes, I agree, my submission did have focus on those areas, but I think they feed into the wider systemic problems of education and children with a disability within education that does feed into higher education as well.
Can you comment on the use of restrictive practices and any recommendations you have around what we should do in that area?
What is good is there's been a challenge to restrictive practices within the department, partly to do with the parliamentary review of restrictive practices across society. What is actually happening in schools is less known because the openness of reporting that came from education systems has been diminished by their unwillingness to always answer questions at budget estimates due to new legal advice that they get from their new legal team, which apparently means that they can't reveal information they used to, such as how many complaints there have been. Obviously, with the banning of mobile phones, there is less evidence now being provided from classrooms where people can see wrongdoing that has happened. So there's lots of challenges going on within there. And I have spoken to senior members of the department about why less information is now provided, or data as what could have been happening, and they can't give an answer either because they are being forestalled by their legal advice, if that helps. So is restrictive practice going on? I would hope less so, as staffing become more aware, better trained in how to support children, and there not being such a need to quickly go to restraint. I think we get worried also about some forms of restraint because chemical restraint is sometimes has been thought, should we be doing that, such as with Ritalin for children with ADHD, but there are some actual areas that could be termed as restraint which are actually required because it allows children to have less anxiety. But yes, the physical restraint in particular, I don't see why we have a need for it, and hopefully whatever the new discipline procedures for behaviour that come into play, is they seem to change. And I have to state, I think Miss Mitchell, when she was the minister, was very bold in introducing the change to behaviour policy for children with a disability, recognising the challenges. Hopefully that will lead staff to find better ways to deal with the situation as they also seek training. Was that diplomatic enough?
Sounded pretty good to me. But, you know, like,
Very diplomatic. Did you want to go?
well, it's moving to a slightly different topic, but I just want to acknowledge your many years of advocacy in this space, which I obviously know from my time when I was the minister. But I wanted to ask about, in your submission, you talk about challenges within the system, and particularly for parents when there has been abuse.
Yeah.
We have heard, not so much in an abuse scenario, but more things like when families have asked for reasonable adjustments
Yep.
that haven't been provided, and there is this recurring theme, which again I'm familiar with, of there's no independent body to investigate. The department kind of investigates itself, and
Yep.
it goes up the chain and comes back, and I'm well aware of the challenges that presents. But I guess from your perspective, how would you envisage some sort of independent body working within the department or separate from? Is there a mechanism that you think would make that an easier experience for families, whether it is something like a reasonable adjustment all the way through to some of those serious sort of abuse allegations?
I find it amazing that within children and disability, and this came up in the discussion of the Royal Commission that was held at the forum by the Parliament. I was asked to speak at that as well, that there is no body to independently support children with a disability. Full stop. There is for aged care, for adults, but none for children. So there is nowhere to go within education. If you go to the police, they refer you to the Professional Ethical Standards Body, who are often populated by former police staff,
Yeah.
so they know each other. And that is part of the department. And the system will often defend itself before it then looks at other issues, unless the challenge is against the staff member who's fallen out of favour with someone above them. I'm that cynical. So yes, we could have a body. The Ombudsman does as best they can, but they can only look at policy
Yeah.
and make sure that the boxes have been ticked. But there's no one to fully investigate. And we know that families with children with a disability already are burdened with time, are burdened financially, and often struggle with just day-to-day living, let alone having to challenge the very system that they need for support, where there's a power imbalance. Because you're going against the very organisation, potentially, whatever school it is, whether it's public or private, or Catholic, to support, you need the support of. So, and within some communities, there is no other school to go to because, while we might live in an urban setting, those further out in the hunter and rural settings have nowhere else to go. So yes, we need to have an advisory body. We do have the disability reference group, but that might be a question you come to me later
well,
about.
But I think I guess from the evidence that we'd heard from families, it was much more having someone, whether it was an advocate to come with them or to help them have an additional voice, particularly with the different layers of bureaucracy that we know exist, just that there's that missing piece for those who need that extra support, and I guess trying to work through as a committee what that could look like and how we could make some recommendations in that space.
I think there should be a state body that is set up particularly for that, that is funded, that is kept separate, has aspects of advocacy, has aspects of legal support, has aspects of policy awareness and expertise from education. I think this is actually something I've been talking about for nearly a decade, and there's others have been doing the same as well. So that is, yes, something I think is desperately needed. I think it would also be useful for schools and teachers themselves, because then they would also know that there was an independent body that was there to objectively look at issues, because at the same time the PES system within the department is also something that staffing can be wary of, because they recognise that ultimately senior management has the authority above them. So no one quite trusts the investigation system within the schools.
Thank you.
Just back on that then. So I think one of the things that I found surprising, I guess, when I first started in the disability portfolio was the tension between kids with disability and their families and teachers that I didn't think was, I thought it was a false tension. So I think, we often, I was often in a situation where if I was advocating for children with disability, it was made out to be sort of anti-teacher, and vice versa, that if you were advocating and saying, look, teachers are really under-resourced and stressed out, that you were somehow anti-children with disability. Where, of course, it's the system that is the issue. Do you think that tension, though, or false tension, or narrative, has then led to a situation where it's not possible to easily complain when you do have a genuinely discriminatory situation within schools?
I think it can depend on the school, and it can depend on the leadership of the school. And I have seen in schools change their senior leadership, and the relationship between the parents, the kids, and the staff really improves or disintegrates slowly. There is a tension because there's a power imbalance, and there always will be. We can't avoid that. The best way to sort that is from the hierarchy of the department or the education body that is running it. Because I am aware that we often talk about the department, and we have to remember that the independent and Catholic sector are part of this as well. In fact, more so all the time, as they recognise that there is a market within disability that they are tapping into rightly, for whatever right or wrong reason. And it's down to actually people talking. I have been criticised sometimes for taking the side of parents, and do I hate teachers? As a 17 years experienced teacher, I used to find that quite offensive, and vice versa. And I think people want to set up that conflict because I think it's within their interests to maintain the status quo, which is again why an outside body would be useful, and why when we have strong leadership from within the department or whatever the schooling is, the sector, that you see that change. And at times when I have contacted certain individuals in the department to intervene, suddenly communication becomes better. I have a personal story that we're not going to share here that was linked to a challenge I had with the department. Last year I met with the secretary of the department, and the first comment they made to me was they said, "The department has not always treated you fairly, and I wish to apologise for that." That was the first time in 10 years a member from the department had actually given an apology for the challenges to the system that my whole family had gone through, as well as other areas that the department had then done to try to do professionally. That meant a lot, and I think that's where the change has to happen. It has to happen with systems recognising that they create barriers, sometimes within the best of intention, because they have to run a system for every child and parent within this state. But there must be a recognition from both sides that there are opposing needs and there must be compromise. And it's why all these challenges of inclusion, of acceptance, of dealing with wrongdoing are nuanced and are not simple. And anyone who says that it's a binary choice and there's a simple answer, they're part of the problem.
Thank you, Ms. Adam.
I sort of want to address some of the comments that you've just made. I think your early comments about the sort of closing down of reporting, and I mean, it's certainly been my observation that there is a default defensive posture from the department. I don't get the sense that there's that it's driven by a sort of malicious intent, right? That broadly speaking, all the stakeholders within the education sector are well motivated and want to do the right thing for kids. And so I wanted to ask you about the sort of that cultural challenge, about how do we change the sort of mindset within the department about how you approach these complex problems around sort of reconciling the kind of competing demands that exist within the system.
I think we can't ever make change if we don't know what is happening. So one of the, again, recurring themes that I maybe have shared to Parliament and members is the idea of transparency, of actually just being open and saying, this is what is happening. We need to know. I understand entirely why at times the department or members of the department say we maybe shouldn't share information, but I think there are ways around that where they can let us know data of positives and negatives that are happening without revealing individuals. And until we get the information, we can't then see what changes need to be made, if that makes sense. And that's not just me as a researcher saying, I love data. I'm not, well, I do love data, but at the same point, only for a purpose. I think change is happening over time. I think it will be interesting to see how Parliament responds to the Royal Commission and whether there is a right, disability right created, federally as well, one of the recommendations, because that will mean that we are mandated. And sometimes that's when the change happens, when laws mandate they must apply something. So going back to the restrictive practices, because there was a mandate coming from the New South Wales Parliament about restrictive practices, the department looked at what was happening and created a new policy for it. So change sometimes has to be imposed because people sometimes are not aware of their ableism. And I think the majority of time in the department that is the case. They do not realise that by protecting their fiefdom area, they are actually reinforcing challenges and discrimination unintentionally to children with a disability. And that also applies within the NESA, within their reasonable adjustments, particularly for HSE, which I'm sure is something you'll speak to Mr. Martin about later. Hope that answers.
Thank you. Ms. Mahalik.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Dr. Roy. I just want to follow on from your submissions to the inquiry and indeed what you've said this morning. Can I just, and you've already sort of touched on this, but this issue around where families and indeed students can go in relation to how they handle any concerns they might have in the classroom or in how they're being treated by a particular school or educational setting. And I know in your submission you've made the point, and I think it's quite valid, that the public school system appears to investigate itself.
Yeah.
And you've also separately stated that we should be looking at resourcing independent complaints body and fully supporting the Ombudsman's office in their oversight of education and disability. So I just want to sort of flag a couple of points. And look, what you've said, certainly throughout the hearing, we're definitely receiving a very similar sort of thoughts and views from other both advocate groups and individuals who are letting us know that they've sort of, there's very little sort of opportunity to seek assistance within the department itself when the department is completely designed to protect its own own authority and indeed their own teachers and staff, and that's natural. I think every department has the same type of cultural sort of values and so forth. However, it becomes a real problem here because there's nowhere for families and students to go to and I wanted to put to you, you mentioned this independent body, because to me personally I think the Ombudsman is not enough. I think it's too bureaucratic, it's too high level, it requires incredible amount of paperwork and that type of high level formal type of conversing with that department, which actually creates quite a big burden, I think, for some of the students and families that are struggling to communicate at all. And I just wanted to ask you, did you have any kind of ideas as to what sort of an independent body might be something that New South Wales should consider looking into, other than having an ombudsman?
Yeah, I think the way that we support aged care and have an overseer, an overseeing body for that would be useful to have for disability, particularly for children with a disability, and to look at all the areas within that and work closely with the Ombudsman. I don't think you can separate. I think there needs to be a close link to that. But yeah, it's as simple as that. As a parliament, they need to look at how children with a disability are being supported, not just in education as well, but within other areas, rather than leaving it to very good organisations, advocacy organisations such as Family Advocacy and others who do step in there. But again, they are independent from even government. And I think that is a concern as well because of their funding being limited. So I think there is a need. I'd probably need to sit down with a bit of paper and work out the details of how that would be organised and look at exemplars of other groupings that have some form of oversight independently and which ones work well. Before I could tell you this is how you do it. So I just feel there needs to be a different investigative body that is separate to the department itself. And the Ombudsman report in 2017 actually indicated that as a potential that should be happening as well.
Also, the Ombudsman, yes, that's in your report as well, isn't it? Yes. Okay. I think that the issue, because I tend to agree that look, that's interesting that you make that scenario of the aged care. So I'm going to have a bit of a look into, and I think the committee could have a look into how oversight works in aged care. Because I feel that that's the missing link really here in New South Wales. And I know we have a Minister for Disability, and but I'm not quite sure now that we don't have a department anymore. I don't know what that role entails anymore, really, and whether that's just an advocacy role up against the feds, possibly is, I'm not sure. But that role doesn't seem to sort of overlay into education at all. So
it needs to be more than just an advocacy role.
Yes.
It needs to be more than, say, the Human Rights Commission's role, which is basically to mediate. And if no mediation can be found, then parents are left to take their own legal action. So yeah, it has to have something with powers to talk to education systems, and not just the department, but also the Catholic and the independent sectors as well.
Because that's absolutely, I agree. It should be able to beyond just public school systems. I think that's what's missing right now. It's that role that I don't think's really existed in New South Wales for more than a decade. That's part of the problem. So there's nowhere. NGIS is such a big, colossal sort of cloud that sits above everything, but again has no authority in this sort of space either. And so the federal government sees that that's really all their role is just NGIS, and so we're missing this sort of oversight body for disability in New South Wales. And thank you for that. I just thought that was a very important part of your submission there, and I think that's something that the committee should be looking into.
Thank you. I'll just check with Miss McLaren-Jones if nothing. Okay. I think, unfortunately, that's all we have time for. We have been a bit tight trying to get as much great evidence as possible within this morning's session. Thank you so much for your submission, your expertise, and for continuing to advocate over decades. So.
And happy to support the committee or committee members in any way that I can be at any time.
Thank you very much.
Thank
that concludes this session. You ready to go? Excellent. Thank you. I now welcome our next witness. Ms. Kordostami, if I could ask you to please state your name and position title and then swear either the oath or the affirmation.
My name is Tina Kordostami. I'm the Director of MHA Design. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you so much. Would you like to make a short opening statement?
Yes, I will follow in Dr. Roy's lead and keep it short. First of all, thank you for having me here today, and I'd first like to acknowledge that we are meeting on Gadigal land, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I am an architectural designer and operations manager in the NDIS disability sector. I have over 7 years of experience supporting those in need, and I have designed various homes tailored to the needs of both physical and mental health disabilities. I have provided a few documents for you all today, and I have made references to my research, which will accompany and further support the topics that I would think is best to be discussed today. Just from an architectural perspective, I believe that the curriculum and the structure of the education setting must go hand in hand with the design and the spatial design of the schools, so that we could see a more inclusive outcome for children who do have a neurodiversity or who are neurodiverse. Thank you.
Thank you. As someone who is neurodiverse and who has neurodiverse children, I know how important it is for the environment to be, you know, I guess easily adaptable, or you know, I know how it can impact, and I've seen how it can impact on children in schools. Are you able to, when we talk about not changing the children but changing the environment in a school context, some examples of what that looks like?
Absolutely. Throughout the years of working with various different children across Sydney and having to speak with the school principal almost daily as an operation manager, because these children are constantly struggling with the current school setting, we've come to realise that there are various changes that can be made to the spaces to at least ensure that these kids are staying at school for longer than an hour or two, or not having to face suspension so often, which we know is a massive problem, not just for the children's learning abilities, but also the families themselves and caretakers. These changes can consist of wayfinding options within the school itself. This isn't just limited to the outdoor areas, but also inside the classrooms and the corridors, helping the students navigate areas which can be very overwhelming and triggering in many ways. The acoustics of the space, of course, from a structural perspective, making sure those thermal and acoustic comforts are taken into consideration, and realising that our senses are not just limited to sight. As we often see a lot of visuals and a lot of colours used within neurodiverse spaces. They are helpful, but there are many other senses that we do need to be considering and keeping in mind. Adaptability, making sure that these spaces can be flexible. You can start including partitions and fake walls. In this way, if a child is becoming overwhelmed, which happens often, they are able to be placed in a separate area, which isn't segregated from class, but it is allowing for them to have a space of their own so that they can bring themselves back to baseline, and you're promoting that sense of autonomy. Time outdoors, it has been proven that being outdoors and engaging in outdoor activities is very helpful for neurodiverse children, especially when they are escalating, and making sure that that is accessible at all times and not so separated from classrooms as it currently is. Transition spaces, so this can be entries, exits, or when entering different types of classrooms, making sure that there is always a space allocated for the child to reassess what's happening and take a minute to themselves and bring themselves back down to baseline again and understand that what they're about to approach is a different space. That timing and that sense of predictability will help keep them calm. And of course, visuals, they are very important. And it's not always about the colors or the materialities that we use. It's also about what's on the visuals themselves, helping the children communicate in various different forms, and making sure that we are always speaking closely with the behaviour clinicians and the speech clinicians and the OTs to make sure that these visuals are relevant to the children. As often we apply a standard of visuals within these schools that are only applicable to 10 to 15% of the children. These are just a quick overview of some changes that we could make within these spaces.
Thank you. And I think one of the other things I read that in the materials you provided is in relation to lighting. I feel, again, from my experience, I find that to be a big one. And it seems quite easy to retrofit as well into existing spaces. Are you able to talk about lighting?
Absolutely. In all of the robust homes that I have designed, I've made sure that every single room has the option of both direct and indirect lighting. Indirect lighting can be lighting fixtures which are hidden and are shown throughout shadow lines. This way the light is able to disperse and not trigger those who do have certain sensitivities towards lighting, and making sure that they are dimmable at all times. So both the colour and the quantity of light being presented needs to be adjustable at all times.
That ability to self-regulate, as you put it, bring yourself back down to baseline, do you think that that's being inhibited, or there's an obstacle to self-regulation when we have school environments that don't have these features?
Absolutely. We were talking about restrictive practices before. In my opinion, suspensions are a form of environmental restraint, because these children, when they present certain behaviours, it's not intentional. It is not for them to act out. It is them showing a natural reaction to a trigger which has been presented towards them. And if our teachers are mandated to have certain training and knowledge or expertise provided to them in regards to ND conditions, they would be able to help the students self-regulate further by, allowing them to have these spaces where they could come back down from an escalation, or to make sure those triggers aren't there in the first place because they are aware of them. That will bring down the quantity, the frequency of current suspensions by quite a lot. A lot of these children that I've worked with especially, no matter how complex their behaviours are, if we do apply the behaviour management strategies properly, and we do this consistently, and we provide the correct staff ratio at all times, the combination of all those elements will definitely ensure for the child to not escalate so often. I think sometimes we don't give the children enough credit for their ability in self-regulation. It's just that we need to be more supportive of them so that they are able to access that capacity.
Yeah, so I'm curious about your work and whether the projects that you've been working on have been in the public sector or the private sector. I had some experience with someone I know who went from an older design school to a relatively modern new build. The classroom sizes had gotten smaller. The capacity to allocate that time-out space was not incorporated in the design features of that classroom, and I wonder, whether these kind of design principles are actually being embedded in the design work that's being done, particularly in the public sector for new build schools.
From based off my research and from what I've seen, it isn't, no. And you've mentioned it, a good point, because the curriculum isn't supportive of these design changes. we can't see those opportunities being presented to architects. So because the schools are under-resourced and we don't have enough staff ratios within the classrooms, even if we were to allocate a space for, a space for just a child to be able to bring themselves back down to baseline, we wouldn't have the staffing available to support them through that. So this is why I had mentioned we need to have an objective look at the overall structure and curriculum at the schools and work alongside with changes made within the space to make sure that the outcome is supportive of the children.
Are we sort of hard? I mean, my understanding of the sort of school build program is, like we're building schools on the expectation that the asset will last for 70 years or more. That's a long period of time to hard, like for hard structures to be in place that don't take into account sort of changes or in relation to how we might use sort of environmental features of design to assist in behaviour management and how we support kids with a disability. I think that's a fair observation.
It is concerning. I've actually worked with schools who have recently gone through a renovation, and once I visited the school, I noticed that not much has changed. They had applied more modern take on the school itself. One method of this is the open plan within the classrooms. This isn't something that necessarily works with neurodiverse children. It's a lot more about the provision of options and adaptability and flexibility within the spaces, and less about the types of tools that we're applying within the classroom. But it is very concerning. I have seen many changes made within the sensory rooms. They have started expanding within those spaces quite a lot, and it's a lot more interactive. But again, sensory spaces aren't always used by neurodiverse children, and we need to make sure that those sensory sensitivities are available in every single room and not just an allocated space labelled sensory room.
Ms. Mitchell?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Thank you for your evidence. I wanted to ask, in the submission it talks about understanding belonging and a sense of belonging and what that means, I guess, in a physical space. And it says here that freedom of expression plays a major role in positive behaviour. In your experience, apart from the sensory rooms and those sort of dedicated spaces, what more could the architecture or the infrastructure of schools be doing to support that sense of belonging for every student, noting that different students might have different needs, but how can we kind of encapsulate that in school builds?
Yeah, so one option is, again, going back to what I was talking about, adaptability. So once you start seeing classrooms that do have walls and partitions which are able to move, you can start speaking with the families of those children and the clinicians involved and understanding what the diagnosis is, what the trauma-based behaviours are and what the triggers are. And then you can start specifically tailoring those separated spaces according to those needs. And then within those spaces you could, further enhance the sense of autonomy within the children themselves by giving them the opportunity to express their thoughts and opinions. When we look at overseas at Scandinavian countries, we see that in certain classrooms they have breakout zones. These zones aren't just a space where you go and sit down and remain calm. It is also a zone which you can tailor to your support needs and likings. It could be the type of materials that's being used, the colouring, the lighting. But it's also letting the child know that this is your space, and it's giving them a sense of ownership, and that sense of ownership then gives them this need to want to look after their space. And this is something that has been proven. Often when we are working with children who present behaviours regarding the vandalisation of the house or wanting to show their aggression towards damaging items within the house, one method used by clinicians is to remind the child that this is your space. It's owned by you and no one will take this space away from you. So to be able to give that option to children within classrooms by giving them a physical space of their own, this would help with their confidence. Also with wayfinding. So wayfinding is often something that we talk a lot about in aged care, especially with dementia. With children in a school setting, wayfinding can also look like having various different options for circulation paths. So if I have a child who becomes escalated in a classroom because there's this one student that is constantly triggering them, currently what we do is remove that child who's escalating from everyone else, segregate them, put them in a space by themselves, and that often does not go well, and the child is either sent home or the escalation becomes worse and they're suspended for a week. If we go back to point one, the child is escalating, and then there's a separate circulation route available from the classroom back into the corridor. We're able to use wayfinding techniques to remove the child from the space where they are being triggered without having to segregate them into a space where they're completely alone. And that route itself, it is able to remove that visual reminder from the child, that visual trigger from the child, again helping them come back down to baseline. So having various different circulation routes surrounding a classroom setting will help with bringing children back down to baseline. Again, flexibility within the spaces, wayfinding, and I'd also say the transition spaces. One example of a transition space is when you enter a house, it's often good to have a open area in front of the entry of the house, which is hidden. Most neurodiverse individuals become overwhelmed when they're changing their space from indoor to outdoor. So giving them a moment of relief as soon as they come out of the door or are entering into a new space. That sense of relief will allow them to prepare themselves for what's to come. Again, with these children, if the classrooms have a point of relief right after the entry, before entering the main space where the class is taking place, that will also help the child prepare themselves for what's to come.
Thank you. That's really insightful.
So it sounds like there's kind of two main components, though, here. You can't just have the environment being sort of neurodiverse friendly. You also need to have people who understand how to use that environment in the right way. One of the other sort of common things that I've found with autistic children is when they're in a noisy space, they will often do noise stimming. So, they've got all of these different audio tracks basically coming into their brain at once. And in order to exert some control and predictability, they will do very loud stimming, which is, can come across to other people as just them being quite noisy and naughty. But when you listen to it, they're deliberately trying to create predictability with that noise. Can you talk more about sort of, I guess, how we reduce noise or provide acoustically neurodiverse friendly sort of environments?
Yeah, absolutely. So from a structural perspective, making sure that our classrooms themselves they're built in a very solid manner. So that means not only having very durable wall systems, but also having additional panels installed on top of those walls, which are acoustic panels. So acoustic panels are typically used on walls themselves, but in many ways you could use it on the floor through carpets. You could start looking at having various different panels placed on top of the walls in terms of decorations. So one element that I've actually had to play around quite a lot with when it comes to acoustic walls is how triggering it could be, again. Because a lot of neurodiverse individuals, because the spectrum is so broad, sometimes they are very high functioning. And so when they do notice elements that are in place to assist or support them, they are taken back by this. They are offended at times. And so hiding these acoustic panels is really important. It's not just about making sure that they're there. And that could look like making sure that the panels are presented in various different forms or shapes and it looks like a decorative item. sound-absorbing panels which are able to move are very important as well. Again, when we're talking about creating separate spaces with those partitions, making sure that those partitions are also installed with these acoustic panels which are able to move with those walls is really important. But I think this also goes back to giving credit to the children and letting them do what they know best to help calm themselves down, and then educating the other children about this process itself. Because sometimes when we try to support neurodiverse children, we tend to limit or control how much they are able to express themselves in a way of us normalizing their behaviors. Instead, if we start educating other children or normalizing the behaviors that are presented by the neurodiverse children, we can focus less on having to deal with the repercussions of how ND children calm themselves and focus more on supporting them calming themselves down so that they could do that in a smaller time frame. When a child is comfortable and feels confident within a space, it won't take them long to come down to baseline.
Thank you. Any other comments? Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all your submission. My question's around the funding, NDIS and education funding, and the disconnect between Commonwealth and state. And I'm mindful that not all children and young people at school are on NDIS plans. So I'm interested to know your views of how that funding structure can be improved, and more importantly, what the states need to do to sort of fill some of those gaps.
Yeah, obviously at times when, especially if a provider is speaking up about the complications involved with supporting children in schools, it sounds like we're attacking schools, but we understand that schools themselves are under-resourced and they don't have that ability to, for example, provide the staff ratio that we're providing within the homes. So, going back and forth with education in New South Wales over the last few years, we've come to realise that the main issue here is that there's no body that the family or the provider or the school can speak to who is across both sectors. We're often either having to sit down and speak with NDIS or sit down and speak with education. And because there isn't that third group which can help connect the dots between the two, nothing ever goes anywhere. And it's often a lot of responsibility that falls onto the shoulder of the provider or the family or the school itself. So having a group or body available for all stakeholders to access who is across both sectors would be very helpful. I think one of the biggest issues that we're seeing with suspensions is that, as we all know, during school hours, NDIS cannot fund the caretakers or the plan for the child during 9 to 3. So what happens with suspensions, and as they are very frequent, either the provider has to tap into their own funds or the irregular funds of the child, which is very minimal, or the family is having to take a lot of time off work and it impacts their whole lives. And yet, when we do speak to education about this concern, the feedback that we receive is, we'll look into what we can do to potentially help you guys with transportation. That's the most we can do. Help pick up or drop off the child so you don't have to spend that extra money having to provide transportation. Even though we've had very extreme scenarios where the child is being suspended every month, and the plan has already ran out in terms of its budget, we're not getting any support shown from education regarding what we need to do going forward. And it's getting to the point where the family is starting to think that maybe the child needs to be in a day program rather than at school, which is quite sad for a 16-year-old to be removed from school just because we can't find a way of supporting them properly. And you know, I think consistency is the key here. When we have all of these reports and data, and when we have this focus on disability as being something that we need to look at from an individual scale, we should be able to take that information in a home setting and apply it within the school setting. And that does mean having one-on-one support if a child clearly requires one-on-one support. Or it does mean looking at the week for the child and not forcing them to stick to the normal school hours, looking at their needs and understanding that this child would benefit from a later start to only 2 hours a day, with only maybe going to school 3 times a week. And we're okay with that because that's according to their needs. And we're going to be making sure that those days and hours where the child is not at school, the NDIS can cover those hours. So it's a lot of, we need a lot of back and forth with the two sectors to be able to allow for the flexibility and supports provided, because it's just not a matter of saying we need to reduce the hours that neurodiverse children are going to school. It's about looking at every specific case and understanding what the specific needs are for the children throughout the week.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think that brings us to the end of the session. This has been incredibly useful and a perspective that we hadn't got from any other witnesses so far. So I think it's really going to be incredibly informative for us. So thank you very much. That concludes this session. We're going to take a short morning tea and we will return at 11 a.m.
Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome back to our next session, and welcome to our next witnesses. If I could start with you, Mr. Graham, if you could state your name and position title, and actually you've already sworn at an earlier hearing, so you don't need to. We'll go straight to you, Mr. Martin, if you could state your name, position, title, and then swear either the oath or the affirmation.
My name is Paul Martin. I'm the CEO of the New South Wales Education Standards Authority. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. And do you, Mr. Martin, have a short opening statement that you'd like to give?
I do, if that's okay. Thank you.
Yes, please.
I'd also like to acknowledge country. NESA develops curriculum, regulates schooling and teacher accreditation, and delivers the HSC for all government and non-government school systems and sectors in New South Wales. NESA's responsibilities around supporting students with disability include ensuring that New South Wales curriculum and assessment is inclusive of all students, including students with disability. Initial teacher education degrees and teacher professional development prepare and support our teachers to teach students across the range of abilities and make appropriate adjustments. And schools fulfil their legislative obligations under the Education Act and the Disability and Discrimination legislation. Our work in this area is supported by NESA's Disability Education Forum. The forum provides expert advice to the NESA board and to the agency about our functions related to disability education. Membership of that forum includes disability education stakeholders and experts, representatives from all sectors, the two unions, and parent groups. Thank you.
Thank you. And just checking with you, Mr. Graham, did you want to make any opening remarks?
Thank you.
Okay, excellent. I think it might. I'm just looking at you, Mr. Diadam.
I think you should probably start with the
No.
opposition.
Okay,
if there's
all right,
questions.
fine. Ms. McLaren-Jones, did you want to start? Nobody wants to start. If we could ask you, Mr. Martin, in relation to the specific courses that teachers can take in relation to educating kids with disability, what do they look like? How many of them are specific to children with neurodiversity? Which ones are mandatory? Which ones are voluntary, etc.? Can you give us some sort of colour on that?
So just to give you some background, teachers have to complete 100 hours of professional learning over a 5-year period. 50 hours of that is via courses that have been endorsed by NESA or provided through their sector, and 50 hours is much more related to teacher choice. They can include both courses in relation to disability and other types of courses. So what NESA does for the courses that are approved by NESA, we have a panel of experts. We have expertise from the disability sector and various medical experts, etc., who have a look at the work, at the application processes that people have put in to run courses, and approve those courses or endorse those courses for teachers to be able to do as approved courses. So the hours count under that heading. We don't mandate any particular courses for teachers to do. We leave it to the teachers. There are teachers at schools who have potentially a particular arrangement or array of students in front of them, and they may need to try and deal with, as you said, neurodiversity, or it might be students with hard of hearing or sight issues. So we don't mandate any particular types of professional learning for teachers to complete in relation to specific types of disability. I might just throw in there, because you've asked the question, we have also mandate that in their preparation as teachers, the initial teacher education qualifications require a mandatory unit on students with disabilities, and then it's also should be integrated into other parts of the courses that they do. So if they're doing things like literacy or numeracy or maths or English or science or something about student welfare, there will be areas of those other parts of their initial initial teacher education qualification that will lead them into students with disability. The courses at university, again, approved by NESA for preparation of students, but they're about, they have some specifics in them, but they're also more general about the sorts of things that teachers will face when they come into schools, and also lead them towards the sorts of choices they might need to make as teachers to upskill themselves depending on the specific students that are in front of them. So I can provide you with a list, and I think it may be we have on record or on notice last time. But we leave it of all the different types of special ed provision and how many units and hours we have, but we don't mandate. We leave that for a professional judgment with teachers, schools, their supervisors, and so on.
So when it comes to that core, I think you said the mandatory unit during the sort of core education for teachers,
Yep.
what does that look like then in terms of what exactly is that, and how many hours does it involve? What sort of level of detail does it go into?
So that's an initial teacher education requirement. I think New South Wales is the only state in the country that requires that. I think most states and territories have content for dealing with special education integrated into all of their preparation. We do have that as well, but we believe, and it was believed back, I think, in the 1980s, that a special unit needed to be prescribed. What that unit looks like is different from university to university. There's over 100 initial teacher education qualifications in New South Wales across 17 institutions. Happy to provide that on record, on notice. And those courses will look different depending on the units that they sit within, and the amount of time different depending on whether it's a 2-year qualification or a 4-year qualification, whether it's a primary or a secondary qualification, whether it's a K to it's 0 to 10 or 0 to 12 in the age group. So depending on the nature of the qualification, those courses will look different. But I think in general, they would all, and I'm extemporising to some degree, but they will have definitions of disability, expose young teachers or beginning teachers to the Act and the legislative requirements, have an understanding about the history of disability and inclusion practices in schools and where we're up to now, and possibly disabuse people from notions they may have had in terms of their own upbringing or their own school experiences, and bring them into a much more current understanding. I think we've probably got a lot more content now about neurodiversity than it might have been evident 10, 15, 20 years ago. But I think I'd have to say that the courses will look different depending on the nature of that particular education program, the intention of it, whether it's primary or secondary or early childhood, and potentially what the university feels is the appropriate focus. But I would suggest that they will have some very general stuff, general content, that would enable anyone to get it up to date to some degree with arguments in the field.
Thank you. How many teachers undertake the sort of optional training in disability units when they're doing their PD?
When they're doing their PD, we would have to, I would have to have I would, again, extemporising, suggest that most teachers over the course of 5 years would do some professional learning in the area of special education and special needs students, etc. I think it would be unlikely that that wasn't the case. Most of the three school sectors run their own professional learning internally, and I would suggest that there'll be disability special education PD in those spaces. I can provide you with the data on notice about what we have, about who does what. Sometimes the titles don't necessarily lend themselves to a specific understanding for our search engines, if that makes sense. But we can provide you with enough of an idea about how many teachers are doing what and through what sector. And we can also, I think the department keeps reasonably strong records of its own staff. So that would also be an avenue for that level of information.
Thank you. One of the things that we were speaking a lot about in our last hearing was in relation to the the reasonable adjustments for students sitting HSC and other examinations. I understand NESA is the one that administers that policy. Is that correct?
We do. If I can give you some background now, or maybe perhaps wait for the follow-up question. Is there?
I was going to ask when was it last updated, and what is the process for reviewing and updating that policy?
That policy was reviewed, I think, just prior to COVID. We used Professor John Firth, who was formerly the Chief Executive Officer of the Victorian Curriculum Authority, they have similar processes there, to review our provisions policy, our HSE provisions policy. I think that they need reasonably constant updating and review rather than waiting for a particular period of time. I think that iterative movement in those policies is pretty important. It's a very fast-moving area. So I'd say it's relatively current at the moment, but it's also always a point of discussion because it's possibly one of the more controversial and or media-focused areas that NESA administers as a policy space. So just some general information for the inquiry for the committee. The HSE is in two parts. Part of it is the assessment of students at school, and they do a particular number of assessment tasks, and that may include exams similar to the HSE exam, maybe their trial exam, but they may also do oral tasks or experiments or dance performances. They might write essays, etc., etc. They are all separate to what NESA runs with the actual HSC exam. Now, the schools apply adjustments for the students within their schools for those internal assessments. And they make judgments and provide appropriate support and whatever, based on some guidelines we provide, but broadly, they have to have their own policy in relation to how they support students to complete the internal part of the HSC assessment. And then we run an application process for disability provisions for the exam. And the provisions for the exam relate specifically to the exam. They're not teaching and learning provisions or adjustments. So, for example, in terms of a school, a person at a school, a young person might be given more support in class or scribes to help with all sorts of internal assessment or rest breaks or extended periods of time to complete tasks even that sit within the school's judgment of appropriate adjustments for that student. When we make a decision about disability provisions, what we're doing is making a decision or making a judgment about how do we best support that student to complete a sit-down 3-hour public examination or 2-hour public examination. So it's quite a specific judgment we're making. So students might need to have particular printing for the exam because of an eye or a sight issue. They may have anxiety or levels of stress, or that mean that they can't concentrate with other people in the room, and so we allow for those students to have some isolation, or some students have a scribe, some have rest breaks, some have drink breaks, some have toilet breaks, some are able to have, because of potential issues to do with their health, can have a bite to eat, or something that might be an energy provider. So we provide for the exam, or we make judgments about what students can have for the exam just so they can complete that 2.5-hour exam. Whereas what happens at the school is a much broader provision. And I'll go to a controversial issue that often arises at the HSC time of year. We will get correspondence from parents saying, when my child does this at school, they get this level of support, but now we've applied to NESA for the HSC and have not received the same support. And that's because the support we're providing and the judgment we're making is about their capacity to sit and do a written exam, rather than the much broader and deeper and richer expectations that are given to or provided to students, or that they have for the work that they do at school. So does that make sense? Have I explained how the difference between what we do is?
It does, and I think one of the sort of lines of criticism around this has been that it's perhaps clearer and more consistent when we're talking about physical disability with the adjustments that are given, not always, but the adjustments that are given to kids in schools versus what NESA agrees to, as opposed to kids with neurodiversity, where a very specific set of adjustments has been developed for them during their schooling because the teachers understand the children. But then when we come to NESA approving that adjustment, NESA says no, and the implication there is that there's not the nuanced understanding of neurodiversity that perhaps there should be under NESA's policies. I guess, what do you say to that?
Yes, I'm aware of the criticism, and it's a developing area. And of course, I say on the record that we absolutely respect both parents and in fact applaud parents and schools' commitment to argue and, I suppose, fight on behalf of the students in their care to get the best they can for the HSC, to be treated fairly. We understand that. What we are doing, though, is making a judgment about the handwriting of a student and how quickly they can handwrite, read, understand, see the questions, etc. It's not I think we've got three computer-based HSC exams, and there may well be more into the future, but at the moment there's just the science extension and the 2 technology exams to come. But the judgment that's made is a writing sample from the student, some advice from a health professional about issues to do with their capacity to read and write the examination, and how much support they need to complete that examination within a reasonable designated period. One of the things we don't want to do is have kids sitting in an exam room for 5 hours trying to complete an English exam. Even though it might be what the students want, we don't think it's in anyone's interest to have that much pressure put on for 5 or 6 or whatever hours. So we're trying to make judgments as well about what's in the students' health and mental health interests. But the primary issue is how much can they write within the bounds of normality, in reasonableness for other students over the period of the exam, and how much can they see in a very physical way of the exam questions. And that's the sort of judgment we make. And that doesn't go to having a range of other adjustments that they may expect or have expected from their school.
So we've heard examples of children who can write for a very short period of time, but then they get quite exhausted by it. But also children who, and this is relevant also for children with autism, where they may have not developed the fine motor skills to sort of hold a pen very well, but it's taking a huge amount of their sort of thinking and capacity to remember how to hold the pen the whole time, whereas what the class or what the exam is really testing is their knowledge. And so they're, I guess in those cases, the question is, why are we making these children jump over hurdles that are to do with their ability to hold a pen and not their ability to actually have retained the knowledge from the subject? Do you think that sometimes NESA's policy has made the wrong decision in those cases?
Look, just to broaden there are some students who, and many now actually, who write very poorly anyway. The capacity of pen-personship has declined quite considerably over the last decade. There are always have been students who write more slowly than others, who write less legibly than others, who read more slowly and then write more slowly. We've always had that range. The issue of neurodiversity and clinical or diagnoses of particular students that show they manifest that in particular ways is the only way we can provide additional supports for those students, because largely they also sit within the range of non-neurodiverse students, neurotypical students, who also have an incredible range of capacity to write that 3-hour exam. And it's getting more telling that the range of that handwriting expectation. Students practice in a way that they didn't in my generation to sit down and write that exam. But the alternatives to that are also difficult in terms of typing. Some students type differently, etc., etc. So we're in a moment of where that is an issue, and the neurodiversity issue sits within a larger discussion, I think.
I think and just from listening to your answer there, part of the problem, I think, is that and I understand that, you're trying not to provide a unfair playing field by giving too many adjustments to kids with disability. But in terms of a physical adjustment in the context of an exam that's testing knowledge rather than physical capacity, don't you think that we should be maybe focusing more on the child with disability and what adjustments they require, rather than whether or not it may, other kids within that same cohort may also have some issues but haven't been diagnosed with? It just seems we're looking at these things a bit backwards. We're looking at it in terms of not over-advantaging kids with disability when all the evidence is showing that's not, like, they either know the stuff or they don't.
So, look, I understand the point you're making. It's a very difficult judgment exercise to, and it doesn't often play well in the public arena or to the carers or parents of students with disability, that the judgments we're making are trying not to give them an advantage. And for someone who's struggled all the way through school, the idea that necessarily saying you can't have this particular support because you would be advantaged by it seems absurd. But the issue is that 3-hour exam or the sit-down exam, and how students are best able to sit within a normal area of a range of capacity to complete that. And as I said earlier, neurotypical students often sit within that range as well. I think that, without sort of sounding like I'm trying to push away that we'd even consider such things, I think we're always in this debate and always in this argument and discussion, and that it's not. What we're trying to do is to try and provide the most level playing field we can, but open to all of the sorts of arguments that emerge in this space and in any space really going over time. Ms. Boyd, I'm doing my best to try and explain that I think we really do a pretty good job. 97% of the applications, I think it's roughly 97% of the applications are approved. Our people are doing everything they can to make sure that not only are the students who apply for provisions looked after, but that there is not accidental advantage, and there is a range. We all know about the quite extreme examples, but there are a range of students for whom the diagnosis is quite minor to some degrees, and we have to try and look after every student at the same time. Basically, that's all I can say, really.
Just before I pass over to my colleagues, I've just forgotten the question I was going to ask.
Come back to you. Mine sort of follows on from that, so I might pick up, Chair, if that's
Please,
okay.
go ahead.
Hi, Mr. Martin. Nice to see you. Just following on from the questions from the Chair, for students or families who do put in an application for, those additional support, special consideration, etc., what is the right of appeal? Or can you just talk us through, like, if they're not happy with that or they feel that they don't get the level of support that they would like, what is an appeals process, or what happens in that instance if schools or students feel like they want someone to have another look at it? Can you explain how that works from Nessa's end for us?
Sure. Look, I would say that in the first instance, preventing students' and schools' expectations being in the wrong direction, or having a realistic understanding of what disability provisions are for and what you might get in the HSC for them. So information, and we've really ramped up the information process. We've been under a level of legitimate pressure over the last few decades around our delivery here. And as I said earlier, this is it's such an emotionally contentious space for the parents and carers around looking after their children. So we make sure that schools now get a very clear, much clearer understanding of how to apply, of what sort of information they have to provide, of what sort of support from paediatricians or from health professionals or psychologists or medical expertise, what sort of samples of the work do they have to provide from the students. So early on, before they apply, we try and put as much effort as possible into giving people an understanding of how the application works and realistic expectations of what it's about. And it's not about, as I said earlier, about being able to do the best you can over the longest period of time, because it's a time-limited exam. They apply. Some parents are actually loath to apply. They feel sometimes that the disability provision stigmatises them. Some young people don't want anyone to know that they could potentially get an isolated exam room for ADHD. I'm just making that up, but that they don't want anyone to know. So there are issues that are around at that end. So they apply. They're assessed by our team, who are many of whom have been in this position for many years. So they're really adept at understanding, and also the social consequences and the appropriate tone and manner in which to talk to parents and schools. Then if we feel that there's not enough evidence, we will go back and ask them to collect more, or another doctor's certificate, et cetera. And I'll already place on record the difficulties with rural and remote students and some students in low SES families getting access to some of that level of expertise. But we need to have some evidence, some expertise and evidence that this is a manifest disability. If that comes back in and we feel it's okay, of course they'll get the additional support. If they don't and are unhappy, we have another level of assessment, which does involve our access to medical experts and counsellors and psychologists and school principals and a range of people. So we have another internal process for that application to go through. Ultimately, they could potentially go down other legal and other processes. I get a lot of representations across Parliament around
I'm aware,
September.
yes.
Yes. And we that will sometimes cause us to have another look at things. I mean, representations to the minister or to myself can open up something, as it should be able to. We go back through the process for 99% of them. But as I said, there's kind of three parts to it. The first part is making sure that they know what they're doing in the first instance with the application. The second is our initial assessment. And then the third is our appeals process that allows for additional oversight. And then of course, there are other avenues. I think if people wanted to go through various legal channels, they could.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Martin, there's been, I'm not sure, you might be able to update the committee in terms of a sectoral imbalance in terms of special consideration for the HSC. I'm not familiar with, or I don't have access to recent data, but perhaps you might comment on whether that's still the case, and if it is still, substantially imbalanced between sectors, what action's being taken to try and remedy that inequality?
Look, thank you for the question. That is just a perennial disability provision HSC issue. If I might mention a former upper house member, John Kay of the Greens, used to, over many years under FOI, as it was then, GIPA now, request the applications and the numbers of approved, etc. And there was a disproportionate number of approved applications into the non-government sector at that period, not because there was any bias or any application of the rules in any other way, but simply because there were more applications coming from one sector than the others. We and my predecessors have, firstly, we released that information publicly, so it's no longer required to go through any sort of GIPA process. We make sure that that's a public piece of information. And we've talked very clearly and openly with the sectors about how we might best have the applications represent better the numbers of the students and the numbers of the students with disability. So the first thing was education processes with the sectors, so giving the department, to be honest, and I've spoken off the record and on the record to Mr. Graham about this in the last 12 months. How do we make sure that that we get more applications in from some of the government schools? Why have they put no applications in when we know that there are kids with disabilities there and they're heading for the HSC? Is it our application process? Is it access to doctors? Are we too bureaucratic? Are the samples, is teacher workload too great for them to go through this process as they're nearing the HSC? What can we as an agency do to cut through all of those issues? The numbers have been shifting in the right direction now for a few years, and I think it has to do with the education processes with the government sector in particular and support that they've provided to their own schools. Some clarification and clarity around our applications has helped. I think it's close to 50-50 now in terms of numbers of disability provisions across in non-government versus government sector, which is a significant improvement, but I still think that there's a fair way to go. I mentioned earlier, there are some parents and some students who simply don't wish to apply, and sometimes that's in some communities. And so we've probably got a bit of education there about how best to explain that this is not a stigma, but in fact an aid and support for young people going through the HSC. And that's the work that we will be doing and have been doing with Mr. Graham and his team. So I can provide on notice, a sort of I think we may have in fact at the last hearing, but we can provide the movements over time by a sector without any problem.
So perhaps Mr. Graham, you might be able to jump in here.
So
just on the question around, I mean, obviously one of the suggestions is that in the non-government sector there is much more intensive support in terms of applications. So perhaps you could maybe elaborate on what's being done within the government sector.
Well, we do know that some school communities access these provisions much more highly, and as Mr. Martin's pointed out, it's due to application, not due to the kind of assessment process. And certainly when I was running schools at Metropolitan South, Mr. Martin came and met with our leadership team. The department's since then taken a more comprehensive view. So we have used the data from NESA to look at schools, at what their kind of individual application rates might be. We've taken a kind of dual approach. The first one is to identify 20 schools which have, unusually low number of applications. So we just look at the data and say, typically in a low SES community, this school, if it was average, would have a lot more applications than that. And so we go and work individually with those schools, particularly around that information piece. Look, these are the kinds of students who in other schools are getting these provisions. These are the kind of provisions they can get, and here's how to assist with the application process. And I think that's probably behind some of the numbers shifting. But we also have a more comprehensive kind of dashboard where we go to the directors of educational leadership who each have, they might have 3 or 4 high schools to say, look, your schools are probably under in where we probably would see a school if it was applying at the typical level. And so we're working with them to just provide that information. Now, as Mr. Martin said, it's not the only barrier. Access to paediatricians and doctors and all those other things are also going to be barriers. But I think we're starting to see some shift based on that, informational side to at least say, look, you should probably consider applying for looking at these students. We know about the students, we've got all this data on them, so we know that they probably have a similar issue to other kids who are getting access. And we certainly want to see parity of access to those provisions because it should be a fair exam.
Mr. Martin, can I ask you, we heard evidence from Auslan users about having a Auslan curriculum in Victoria. Maybe you might be able to shed some light on what the status is in New South Wales in relation to offering Auslan in New South Wales schools.
Auslan was introduced as a language in New South Wales from New South Wales schools from, I think I was at the launch. It was might have even been before COVID, but it is now, Auslan is now a recognised language to be taught in New South Wales schools.
And so, in terms of the curriculum, how is the rollout of that looking? Is it offered as a HSC subject, or like what's? Perhaps you could elaborate on, what stages the Auslan curriculum is available to be offered.
I will. I'll also, again, there's probably some specifics there that are not in my notes, but there's a syllabus that's been completed and written. Students can do it, I think, from K to 10, but certainly from 7 to 10, and I'll clarify that on notice. Oftentimes, the delivery of languages in schools is dependent entirely upon the capacity of the teacher to teach them. And so with the arrival and the approval of Auslan as a language in New South Wales a couple of years ago, we of course now have teacher training institutions have added it to their preparation programs for teacher training. So there will be now more Auslan teachers. So it's a matter of whether the school will offer it. And we don't just expect it to be offered to students who are hard of hearing. We think that Auslan will be popular amongst students more broadly, and students who have hard of hearing members in their family or parents or carers, etc. But there's a little bit of a time lag, and first of all, we have to have the syllabus out there, and then over time we can ramp up both the capacity of the schools to deliver it, the support that's provided for it, etc. But we've already done that, and I actually, I'm not sure about my Victorian colleagues, thought we were slightly ahead of them, but I'm not sure about that.
Are you able to, on notice, just provide some detail about the uptake in terms of how many schools are offering Auslan as part of their curriculum?
Whatever details we have, I will provide.
I'll just go to Mrs. McLaren-Jones.
Thank you very much. I was interested to find out a little bit more, and this is for Mr. Martin, in relation to when you're considering adjustments, and particularly whether additional resources are needed, staff for breaks or actual materials. Do you factor in the cost that might be to the localised school, or is that something that isn't considered and it's just a matter for the department?
What we do is the conduct of the HSC exam in the schools is responsibility of the schools. We provide guidelines and provide some level of support. We simply cannot, as our agency, run all of the various supports that would be required across New South Wales for all of the students who require disability provisions or get granted disability provisions. But we quite often have schools call us up and ask us if we can provide some advice for a scribe or someone to help or assist with. So we can assist in terms of our contacts and how many times we run the HSE every year. But as for the financial resources to pay for the variety of provisions, no.
I suppose
we print. Sorry, excuse me.
No, you go.
We print. I think there's some. We do print the papers when the issue is for someone who's visually impaired. NESA, of course, is responsible for the printing of papers differently than they would otherwise be.
Do you think in any way, I suppose, where you've had some schools with a lower number of requests, could that be impacted potentially by resourcing at a local level?
It could be. I mean, I think in terms of application process, and both myself and Mr. Graham have mentioned, and a problem that's possibly becoming more acute, certainly over the COVID period, is access to medical professionals. This is a much bigger issue than the HSC. This is a societal-wide issue, but I think that is potentially something that has been in the way of some students or some schools being able to provide the evidence to us. But over the era of COVID, we made so many accommodations. I use that phrase in its pejorative sense. We made so many accommodations for schools across New South Wales through southwestern Sydney regional, rural and remote schools, so that they weren't locked out by our rules that were bureaucratic rules for a particular era and were no longer appropriate for COVID. So we need to constantly look. I'm not putting anything on the table, but constantly look at how we don't allow something like a shortage of health professionals or just GPs. Students not being able to complete an assessment task during the COVID period, they just couldn't all go to a GP. I mean, GPs were just completely overwhelmed. So we made a change to our policy to allow that to occur. So just this balance is about how do we do the right thing by the students, accommodate the current social circumstances and shortages, et cetera, but also maintain the fidelity of the exam, because it is an exam and students need to be treated fairly. But the short answer to your question is yes, I think that there have been issues in terms of provision of, I think it's hard in some areas and localities to get some of the access to the support.
Mr. Graham, would you like to comment on that from, I suppose, a department resourcing point of view, or is it something that Department of Education needs to look more broadly at other agencies within government as to how they, I suppose, carry some of that load?
Well, we know it's a family resourcing issue rather than a school resourcing issue, because the requirements are that you need kind of external validation from a psychologist or a doctor and so on. So I know our schools have local arrangements where they do what they can. They might arrange for private psychologists to assess a number of kids at once, but that's a workaround. That's not a comprehensive solution. We don't have an answer. We've certainly been talking to Mr. Martin about the balance. We respect their responsibility to the HSC, and we've been very proud in New South Wales of this qualification. So we respect their role in terms of protecting the integrity of it, but the practicalities of how some families won't be able to access the evidence they need to be able to provide. So we're certainly having active conversations about that.
I'm sort of more interested in the actual, I suppose, the adjustments and the recommendations that are made, and whether or not they actually then can be fulfilled at that local level, and how is that managed?
So certainly the adjustments for the HSC are managed very well at the local level, and I think, as Mr. Martin's indicated, there's not an extensive array of adjustments. I think it was kind of some of the conversation the committee was having at the beginning. Principally they're things like an additional 10 minutes, might be a scribe, those kinds of arrangements. And our HSC, we have a very strong, centrally supported HSC kind of program within the department, and so we support schools in providing those provisions.
One final question for you, Mr. Graham, in relation to a submission received and witness from this morning. It was raised as one of the challenges in the system, the confidentiality settlement agreements. And they indicated in their submission that there was potential, and I quote, that abusers could stay in the system and abuse children with no knowledge of prior allegations being made. Is there another way of dealing with these complaints and I suppose the settlement outcomes?
I'm not sure that settlement outcomes would be a way of not disclosing within our own system that previous allegations had been made. So we have very strong, very, very strong provision through our professional and ethical standards area around any kind of staff disciplinary action, particularly when it involves child protection. That's not something that a kind of confidentiality agreement would be preventing us from knowing about someone's prior history.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Before I go to Ms Mitchell, just check. Ms Mitchell.
Thank you, Chair. I just have a couple of questions for Mr. Graham. We had some evidence earlier today from the National Union of Students, and both of the students talked about that transition period from having, I guess, disability support while they were at school to then going into either work or further study. And there was a comment around they felt that sometimes students with disability tend to be steered more towards going into employment rather than further study, and that there could be better supports, particularly in the senior years, to help those young people to transition. Is there any information you could provide in terms of what schools do specifically to help those students to transition and give them that pathway which has a range of options like all students have available to them?
Yeah, so certainly we have pathways advisors and so on who work across schools, but within a school, one of the critical roles is the careers advisor, who kind of not just about what kind of work, but in fact, given that 70% of kids will go on to either higher education or TAFE and so on. One of their critical roles is now kind of linking them up with that further education. So we know, for example, if you're going into vet, they can advise them the fact that we've got fee-free courses, that TAFE and other providers will be provided with additional loading if they take on that child and that student. That if you're going to an apprenticeship, that there's actually support. So the State Training Services area will provide actual ongoing support to make sure that the employer is understanding all the Commonwealth subsidies that also exist. A lot of the time it's trying to line them up with that. And certainly the provision in universities. So universities, they have a lower proportion of students with a disability than they should. They provide a lot of incentives, a lot of support within that university. But of course, when you're a student in our school, you don't know that. So I understand you feel a bit like, well, I feel like I'm just dropping off a cliff here. So those roles kind of increasingly are trying to support people. Scholarships, we know particularly the big universities, they have a large amount of money with scholarships that they can't even spend. So our job is to, have our students be able to access those opportunities. So I think it's not perfect, but it's something.
Yeah, I mean, and I think one of the key points that I took away from their evidence was that almost having somebody, and I'm not sure where they would fit in terms of who they would be employed by, because obviously I get it's challenging when a student leaves school, but that transition period where, one of the spoke about her family did it and her mum was able to, but, she could speak English and was from a family that could give her that support, and not every child has that, or every student has that. So, I guess I'm just thinking whether there's some sort of role somewhere, and I'm not sure where they would be best based.
So some universities, would have done very well, particularly with low SES students.
Yeah.
So call out UTS as kind of one of the first moves to really come into our schools, and so they actually, employ our previous students who now work at the university, and they come into our schools and they provide, I think, probably more of that transition. I think they're the kind of models that would be probably really helpful.
Yeah. So an expansion of that, and
so they can actually come in, because we might. It's kind of a bit hard when if you it's like, well, we can help you to a university. We only go so far. It's that. It's like all the transition points. The more they can reach down into the schools as well, the kind of smoother the transition is.
Okay, thank you. And just one more quick one. And you might have to take this on notice, because I appreciate that you're not in charge of all of the finances at the department. But just in relation to some of the budget changes that principals were advised in April, would you be able to clarify that no SSPs were impacted by that?
No, I can clarify. No SSPs were impacted by that.
And what about the, colloquially it's sort of called the freezing of other money that was in accounts that principals had time to spend, but it's now gone back centrally. Again, was there an impact on any SSPs
I'll
with
have
that
to
decision?
take that one on notice.
Yeah, thank you. That's all I had. Thanks, Jay.
Can I just go back to you, Mr. Martin? Just one of the things that was raised by Down Syndrome New South Wales when they appeared before us was in relation to their students having to basically provide more documentation that they thought was reasonable, having to go back as well and provide further information on their diagnosis as a person with Down syndrome, and they was basically pointing that out to us as being a little bit ridiculous. That people have known that they've had Down syndrome since they were born. So why is NESA asking them to go and get that sort of diagnosis? Were you listening to that evidence? And no. Is that...
I can try and answer. Look, there's a range of students with been diagnosed or have Down syndrome. There's a range of abilities and capacities in the same way as in the rest of the community, and all I can imagine is that the extra information we've been asking for people is how does the disability manifest in terms of, for the exam, in terms of comprehension of questions and writing speed. And we shouldn't be asking for a diagnosis. That sounds unless I can be told something by my office that we ask for a particular reason, it seems to be nonsensical to require additional proofs or diagnoses than something that is obviously been long understood. I would say that for more broadly, that if a student has come to year 7 with cerebral palsy or, a significant disability that is already well established and manifest right through their schooling, then there shouldn't be asking for additional proofs. We need to find out how not to create difficulties. I think we already, after the Firth report that I mentioned earlier, allow for applications much earlier than we would have otherwise in order for those students to be cleared from our system and, just dealt with very quickly because of the obvious nature of the disability. But I'll have a look at that happily to see.
Perhaps I've misremembered it, and it was about going and getting sort of more doctors' reports rather than diagnosis as such. But I guess the sentiment expressed was that in the context of young people trying to get on in life and be positive about all of the opportunities that they have and, fighting all of that discrimination and ableism, to then have to sort of prove all of a sudden that they can't do things in order to then get the adjustments that are due to them when the school already knows and everyone else already knows. It's quite damaging on their mental health. And I'm just, wondering if Ness has considered, I guess, the impact of some of that evidence being required in circumstances where it's been clear throughout a schooling career that a person has a particular disability.
We need to make sure, in order to provide the best for the student, the most support, the rest breaks, the drink breaks, the whatever, exactly how the disability manifests. So we probably will require, if that information, it's often in schools already, but we do need some level, and you can imagine why, of a third party, an independent assessment and analysis. And I understand how that might affect the students' mental health by having to demonstrate that they're not good in order to get something that's supportive. I understand that. All I can say is that the additional evidence we require would be so that we can A, have proof, and B, provide the most support. But I'm not going to be silly about saying that we can't work better with the department or any school sector or any school if evidence is already in existence and it looks pretty good evidence to us. We should be able to do something with that. Again, as part of the process of this hearing, I will take some of the conversation back to the team.
And I guess, part of this is a risk assessment, right? So it's looking at how likely is it that you are over adjusting for people in the context of that process. If the process is arduous and onerous and people aren't doing it because they can't get documents together, or they're not doing it because it makes them feel bad about themselves, having to prove what they can't do when they're really keen to prove what they can do, weighing that up against the risk that somehow you're going to give more adjustments than a person's required. Do you keep data? For instance, I can imagine, it seems like, I guess obvious, but if you had this sudden spike in Down syndrome kids doing so much better than the rest of the school population, maybe you'd think, they're getting more adjustments than they should. But I expect that's not the case. And then in the absence of that, it doesn't seem like there's much risk. So maybe we should be erring more on the side of providing an inclusive adjustment process for those children.
I agree with what you've said, Ms. Wood. I think that the balancing act there is the fidelity of the exam, the disadvantage to other students, the most support we can give realistically to the student with disability, not becoming onerous in terms of application processes or diagnosis or other support. So that's the space we operate in, and our critics would say that we haven't got it right, but I think we're constantly adjusting and will continue to do so. But I agree that it shouldn't be a disincentive when the worst case scenario is never been manifest.
And given the gross, I guess, disadvantage and discrimination and poor outcomes that kids with disability are expected to have, et cetera, I guess if you had data that they were somehow benefiting more than they should.
I don't suspect that that's the case.
No, so maybe we've got the balance a little bit not quite right. Maybe.
I'm not going
to. Okay, sorry. I'll just check if there are any other questions before we wrap up. No, we're all good. Thank you so much. Thank you very much for making time. This has been incredibly useful for us. To the extent there are questions taken on notice or supplementary questions, the committee secretariat will be in touch. But that concludes this panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation.
Our next witness, if I could ask you to please state your name and position title and then swear either the oath or the affirmation.
So my name is Lisa Ridings. I'm the Associate Chief Executive of Student Services at the Association of Independent Schools in New South Wales. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. And would you like to commence with a short opening statement?
Thank you. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet, the Gadigal people, and pay my respect to elders past and present. And I would also like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people engaging in today's hearing. Thank you to the committee for the opportunity to contribute to this inquiry. The Association of Independent Schools New South Wales is the peak body and membership association supporting and representing independent education, specifically independent schools in New South Wales and ACT. There are 426 independent schools across 563 campuses in New South Wales, and what characterises independent schools is their diversity. The majority of independent schools operate autonomously and are responsive to the needs of their school community. Importantly, AIS New South Wales is not a governing body of independent schools. The New South Wales independent sector had an estimated 46,900 students, so around 22%, with a recorded disability in 2023. The majority of students with disability, around 90%, in the New South Wales independent sector attend a mainstream school. The New South Wales independent sector has 64 special and special assistance schools that are spread across 145 campuses, providing choice for parents to be able to identify the best educational experience for their child. The student services portfolio at AIS New South Wales that I lead includes a team of 11 specialist education and health professionals that are responsible for the delivery of services that are focused on disability, diversity, attendance, mental health and wellbeing. And this also involves assisting member schools in the application of legislative requirements in the education context. In 2023, Student Services had almost 8,500 engagements with schools that involved providing guidance to member schools regarding individual student matters. So that could be related to support with enrolment processes for students with disability. It could be supporting schools around the facilitation of the collaborative planning process, including the identification of reasonable adjustments, or assisting schools in liaising with external specialists. We also provide proactive whole-of-school approaches to assist schools to strengthen the academic, behaviour and wellbeing outcomes for all students. And these approaches are really tailored to the school's context and designed to build the confidence and strengthen the expertise amongst the school personnel. I'm really happy to respond to any questions that the panel may have.
Thank you. Well, I will start us off. Do any of the independent schools provide data in relation to expulsions and suspensions? Do you know?
So the data that schools would have would be held at a school level, and AIS would not seek to gather that information. Yeah.
Has that ever been something that's been suggested as a potential for independent schools? Is there any appetite to do that? Because it'd be incredibly useful to see.
Not that I'm aware, but certainly I know that schools utilise that data at a school level to be able to inform the kinds of approaches, interventions and supports that they do provide at a whole school level, but also at an individual level for students.
Okay. There's anecdotal evidence, at least, that there are fewer suspensions and expulsions within sort of independent schools than within the public sector. If that is true, I guess, why do we think that's true? What do you think it is about the independent school settings that allows them to be a bit better on that?
I think certainly independent schools work really hard in terms of being able to provide really personalised and individualised support for students with disability. I'm very mindful I can only speak on behalf of the independent sector, but I'm mindful that I think regardless of sector, all schools work, towards providing a really high quality education for all students, and in particular students with disability. What independent schools do very well is they work through a collaborative planning process, and so that would involve gathering information about the students' needs, and that could involve liaising with external specialists, of course involving input from the student and the family as appropriate as well. Based on that information, they work in collaboration with the family and the student to be able to identify the reasonable adjustments, to implement those adjustments, and to monitor and review the effectiveness of those. Regarding behaviour in particular, certainly schools, depending on their school's ethos and their values, they will have a whole of school approach to behaviour, and as mentioned earlier, there would be some universal supports in place for all students, as well as more targeted supports, and then for small groups of students, and then individualised interventions where appropriate. So I think the personalisation is something that independent schools do very well.
It seems that non-public schools are also a little bit more proactive and better at putting in requests for adjustments when it comes to HSC time as well, as we've just heard. Is there, what do you think the reasons are for that?
I think certainly over time, and I have just listened to Mr. Martin speaking from NESA, over time NESA have been very responsive to the feedback that has been provided in reviewing the policies and processes around accessing disability provisions. What ultimately does appear and comes up every year around the data in terms of the sectors accessing the disability provisions, I think what sits behind that data is, regardless of the sector, they are students with disability who are otherwise accessing disability provisions that they are entitled to. And so I think that the focus remains on actually being able to support schools around the processes to access those is the critical point in the conversation that often gets raised each year.
Thank you, Ms. Mitchell.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you so much for being here and for the submission from the AIS as well. I wanted to ask about a couple of the recommendations, but I'll start with the last one, which picks up on something that you probably heard me ask earlier for Mr. Graham, just about how there can be better support for post-school opportunities for students with disability. You talk in your submission about aligning the curriculum and also offering adjusted VET courses. Could you elaborate on that a bit more for the committee in terms of things you've seen that work, and also maybe how that could be expanded more broadly?
Yeah, I think what we know works really well for students in terms of their transition pathways post-schools is where those planning processes happen early on, and obviously in collaboration with the student as well as with their family. And also that the opportunities or the pathways that are being explored really build on the strengths of the young person. Certainly there are academic pathways that are pursued, as well as perhaps alternatives around. It could be apprenticeships, for example, where, as I said, where that planning process is able to occur before even the student is in year 11, starting as early as year 7. That is where we see the best outcomes for students, and also where the external universities, or whether it be TAFE, have engagement with schools and really good relationships with schools, and I think that ultimately provides better information for schools around what pathways are available.
Do you think that the idea of having, I guess, as I mentioned earlier, some sort of role of whether it's the TAFE or the universities coming into schools more, but just that transition period, because to your point, I agree, the earlier the better, but in some instances that's not possible or it doesn't occur.
Yeah.
Do you think there's a gap or a space for sort of better wraparound supports to help students transition from school to whatever their post-school destination looks like?
Yes, and I think schools would really welcome clearer information around what pathways and options are available. Yes.
Thank you. If I'll just ask one more, Chair, and then I'll hand over to somebody else. The part of your submission where you talk about increasing access to medical specialist and allied health workforces, and particularly in rural and remote areas, and as someone who lives in the regions, I wholeheartedly endorse that. Do you have any sort of examples within independent schools where, for instance, schools might employ themselves the allied health specialists, whether it's speechies or OTs? I know that some public schools have done that in the past with their funding. Is that something that you're aware of in any independent schools, and has that been successful?
So certainly special schools and special assistance schools as well would have access to on-staff allied health professionals in terms of speech therapists and occupational therapists. Students with disability enrolled in mainstream school settings, they may, as part of their NDIS plan, have particular allied health services where that service may be provided at school. In those instances, I really think schools are best placed to make decisions around what that might look like within a mainstream setting. At times, understandably, the therapists may seek to use particular spaces within the school or have particular times allocated where they can see students, but from the school's perspective, perhaps those times may involve, for example, withdrawing the student from the literacy block. And for a student with learning needs, we know that it's really important for them to be part of that literacy block and not be withdrawn at that time. So I think those decisions are best remaining at the discretion of the principal to be able to make. But certainly, yes, there are really good examples of where schools will utilise if they don't have the expertise in-house, such as they do in special schools, they will have really good relationships with external providers.
No, sorry, you go.
And seek to engage if the student or the parents have preferred providers. Certainly, always we liaise in collaboration with those specialists.
Because we heard evidence in an earlier hearing about, you just mentioned the timings of when people come and how that can be not problematic, but it just, it's a good idea in theory to have the health professionals more engaged in the school setting, but depending on the availability and the timings, it can be a little bit tricky. So, that's something that I think we'll have to ponder over as a committee in terms of how we go on that moving forward. But I'll hand over to someone else.
One of the key issues that this inquiry is grappling with is the question around the Disability Royal Commission recommendation around ending segregation. I think your recommendation seems to place your organisation firmly in the camp that is opposed to that. Perhaps you might give us some insight about how or why you've taken the position that you have in relation to that recommendation.
I would start from the outset by saying that we really respect the thorough work that has been done by the Royal Commission, and I think the report certainly reflects the complexity of some of the issues faced by people with disability and those who also support them. In terms of educational settings, as the independent sector, we are an incredibly diverse sector. And as mentioned in my opening remarks, that includes mainstream schools as well as special schools and special assistance schools. Importantly, what the different school settings does is, just as we would say when you're identifying adjustments for students with disability, it's on a case-by-case basis. Around the actual educational setting for a student, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And so I think often a special school or a special assistance school can offer perhaps different supports and access to appropriate specialists within the school that possibly a mainstream school setting may not. So I think importantly though, it's about parent choice, and I think parents are certainly best placed to be able to make decisions about what is the most appropriate educational setting for their child.
Can I ask about you make a recommendation around providing greater capacity for health professionals to work closely within educational settings. Can you perhaps just elaborate a little bit on that recommendation and the kind of the nature of the obstacles that you see exist in the independent sector?
I think in particular we see around the area of school counsellors. Independent schools don't have access to the funding that other sectors do around that being provided with school counsellors. That said, certainly a lot of schools have committed to paying for school counsellors to be available for students to access. And where that arrangement isn't in place, schools may have an arrangement with an external practice for students to be able to access those supports. Or the school may also signpost to and provide the family with some relevant options around that. I think where we see the best possible outcomes for students with disability is where there is that opportunity for the collaboration between the specialists, whether that be external or within the school, the student and the family. And I think that's where that recommendation is suggested in terms of at times, schools can receive particular recommendations from specialists, perhaps around what, based on the student's needs, but then the school would be best placed to be able to consider, in consultation with the specialists, actually what that looks like within the school context. Yeah.
Oh, I'm back. Has Ms. McLaren-Jones had a chance to ask questions? Please go ahead.
No, I'm fine, thank you.
You don't have any? Okay. I think I'm all...
Oh, well,
please go ahead.
Will, thank you. We're going to go line by line through all your recommendations the way we're going, which is good. I did want to ask about the professional learning component of, I guess, what's available to teachers in independent schools. And you do talk about the need for higher education to ensure that, you know, teachers are well equipped to support and teach students who have all different types of disability and learning needs. Where do you think some of the gaps are in terms of the higher education courses for particularly beginning teachers and ways that we could improve that process?
I understand that there's work already underway around pre-service teachers in particular, strengthening the support for them through those initial teacher education programs around providing support for students with disability. Mm-hmm. I think the increasing the number, like in terms of providing greater access for those students to, at the moment in some courses I understand there might be one course focused on supporting students with disability, so potentially expanding that, but also allowing students, as universities do, to have that experience within the classroom where they really are learning around how they do cater for the full needs of students within a classroom setting is important as well.
Because we heard evidence, as I said in an early hearing, about particularly that, you know, and it does depend on the university and the course, but some, from our sort of perspective, only having quite a minimal period of time to look at, you know, those specific sort of special education units if people don't go on and do further study in that space. And then the other thing that we are looking at is particularly, I guess, that ongoing teacher training as best practice evolves in terms of supporting particular students. How do you support your teachers in terms of that sort of evolving best practice and their own professional development?
So we do provide professional learning for independent schools in the area of supporting students with disability, and a lot of schools will have that as part of a regular cycle of professional learning, and then depending on teachers' particular roles, or it may be how students within their class are identifying, they will also access specific professional learning. It could be, for example, around neurodiversity. As I mentioned earlier, schools are certainly committed to having in place a regular cycle of professional learning. But where we find we get the best outcomes in working with schools is where that professional learning is ongoing and sustained, because we know then there's greater chance of that being embedded as part of the school, the whole school's approach to actually supporting students with disability.
One of the other pieces of evidence that we heard, and I know it's different in a sense for you because you're not a systemic group of schools like the Catholic or government schools are, but in terms of encouraging teachers to take on additional sort of learning opportunities around doing masters in special ed, but the evidence was that there wasn't really a financial or a professional recognition for those classroom teachers who did that, and that was certainly evidence that we received in the government school setting. Are you aware of any examples in independent schools where there are additional incentives for those teachers who do take on sort of, or upskill in terms of special education, and any sort of best practice that we could be made aware of?
I wouldn't be able to comment. I would need to take that question on notice. I wouldn't be across the arrangements within each of the individual schools. That said, something that we have provided for schools, recognising the unique position that we are in being able to bring together schools, is that we have particular network groups focused for teachers in schools that have roles around wellbeing, school counsellors, and this year we initiated a group specifically for learning support teachers. The membership of that group since the beginning of the year is 170 teachers. Our wellbeing group has about 120 representatives from different schools, and the school counsellors about 230. I think that certainly speaks to the desire for people in those roles to be able to connect, to be able to share practice, and also be provided with input and updates. So they are certainly keen and eager to learn and ensure that they are doing all they can within their school context to meet the needs of students.
Thank you. That's all I had, Chair.
All right. I think that's all the questions for now. Just double checking. Thank you so much for making the time today. To the extent that there are supplementary questions, we will be in touch, or the Committee Secretary will be in touch. But that otherwise does conclude the public hearing for today. Thank you
very much.
Thank you.